Welcome to MF Garza Law Firm, helping injured victims one Texan at a time.
Hello and welcome to MF Garza Law Firm, helping injured victims one Texan at a time with Miguel F. Garza, the founder of the MF Garza Law Firm. My name is Kevin Rosenquist, and today we're going to talk about trucking accidents in Texas. What's really behind the wreckage? Miguel, it's so great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure. I'm happy to be here, and hopefully we can provide some good information to fellow Texans today.
That's the plan. That's the plan. You're a lifelong Texan, right?
Absolutely. Yes, sir. Born and raised.
All right. Well, you're dedicated then. That's good. That's good. So what are some of the common causes of trucking accidents in Texas, and what factors contribute to the severity of the incidents?
That's a good question. One of the biggest factors in a trucking accident is driver fatigue. There's a lot of different implications that come into these drivers that when they have to go and make deliveries, they got to do it in a timely fashion. If they don't, then they're going to lose pay. So typically these drivers are not getting proper sleep or proper rest. When they're supposed to be sleeping, they're doodling on their phone or, just going down the rabbit hole on whatever social media they follow. Distracted driving is a very big one too, such as using cell phone while driving. Most trucking companies have no cell phone driver policies, but it doesn't stop them from doing that because, quite frankly, truck driving can be very boring.
Sure.
So, in certain cases that there's been that I've represented victims in trucking accidents where we found out that the truck driver was watching a YouTube video at the time of his wreck and then caused a 4-car pileup on the highway that shut down the highway for about 5-6 hours simply because he was watching a video. And we were able to preserve that video or preserve the phone, and we were able to do a physical download to download the data. And our expert was able to, it's a cell phone forensic expert. He was able to establish that this gentleman was on the phone at the time. So that's a very big one. A few other ones, such as what's also called downloading data from the truck, such as what's called an ECM module, also known as like a black box. There's black boxes in most vehicles nowadays, but specifically on trucking rigs to let them record whatever data may be relevant to that, such as speed, braking, steering, things of that nature. And, acquiring such data like that can really help establish what the driver was doing. Was he actually paying attention? Was he doing his job? Or like in the case I referenced where he was on his cell phone, was he distracted in some fashion, or help establish maybe how much he had been driving and when he should have been resting. So it can definitely be a big factor. And obviously another big one is weather. If there's a snowstorm or a rainstorm out there under the trucking laws, which is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, they're required to slow down and pull over until it's reasonably safe for them to continue driving and completing their delivery. So a lot more regulations and laws that come into play with a trucking accident or trucking wrecks, Texans mostly have to follow the rules of the road, such as like the Texas Transportation Code, which is much smaller than the federal regulations, like this book. You can see that
that looks like some light reading there.
Yeah, it's you see it's all tabbed up. There's all kinds of good stuff in here, but every truck driver and company has to abide by these rules,
right?
Which is why they get audited by the United States Department of Transportation, usually on a biannual basis, just to confirm that they're doing everything that they're supposed to do. So pretty unique in that aspect, but much more stringent laws that apply to truck drivers and trucking companies as opposed to your average driver.
And we've all been on road trips. We've all been on, or at least driven long distances, and fatigue's a real thing, even in a car. You get tired, your mind starts to wander, and you're not focused, and your eyes are heavy, but you're driving this gigantic truck that's like super, super dangerous. And you said that it was mostly because of money, because time is money, sort of thing.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
Is that
because
pressure coming from the trucking company, you think?
Absolutely. Well, and it's coming from the trucking company primarily, but it could also come from the truck driver. Truck drivers are decent people. I've met plenty of them, and a lot of them are just doing what they're told to do, and a lot of them are really just trying to help their families and support them. Just like any typical parent would. And in a lot of these cases, if they don't get to a certain delivery point or a delivery at a specific time or a specific point, then they can essentially lose their income from that particular delivery. So, and sometimes these drivers can be incentivized, like, okay, if you get here earlier, within a specific time frame, you might get a bonus. So instead of getting that 8 to 10 hours of consecutive sleep, they go ahead and just don't do that and take a bunch of, whether it's Red Bull, stimulants, other medications perhaps, that will make them more awake, but typically that doesn't always increase their reaction time or their ability to, notice a hazardous condition.
There was actually a Simpsons episode about that where Homer's a truck driver and he's popping pills the whole time to stay awake. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
fairly
yeah,
common
I'll
in the
bet.
industry.
I mean, yeah, if you're giving bonuses for time, I mean, yeah, I mean that who wouldn't try to push through, or most people would.
Yeah.
What are some of the types of serious injuries that you see in truck cases?
Well, one interesting fact that, maybe most people don't know, and I'm sure a lot of people understand, that trucking vehicles, your 18 wheelers, your moving trucks, and, the tractor trailers, things like that, those things can weigh up to 80,000 pounds. That's more than the weight of a modern tank nowadays. 80,000 pounds is there's a huge object just moving at you that, high rates of speed that can obviously be very damaging. So I've seen everything from your broken bones, amputated legs or arms. And unfortunately, sometimes the things that cause death, or, in certain cases, paralysis to certain body parts. It's very tragic what can happen with these. And that's why those federal regulations are in place to help encourage safety. And that's why there's way more trucking laws that are relevant to the truck drivers and trucking companies that must abide by than your typical average driver driving a family vehicle, for example.
You must have seen some stuff that's pretty tough to digest.
Well, I definitely, when I was in law school, I wasn't sure how I would handle such things because I've heard a bunch of war stories from professors and other lawyers that I worked with.
Sure.
It's really just trying to keep a good head on your shoulders and stay mentally healthy, and, try to, stay physically active, because if you're not staying healthy, you're not going to be able to help out your clients to the best of your ability. And, when it comes to big trucking accidents, it's not just the injuries to the victims, it's the hardship that the families go through. They're losing their supporter, their financial supporters, for example. They may not be able to, deal with the grief and, resort to alcohol or drugs or other things that are very difficult to deal with. And it's one of the biggest things that's why we're trying to help Texans and Texan families here to help hold these 18-wheeler companies accountable.
What legal issues make trucking accident claims more complicated compared to maybe, like a typical car accident that we would see?
One of the most important things to do when a trucking accident occurs is hire an experienced civil litigation attorney immediately. That having an experienced attorney is very important, because one thing that these trucking companies usually do is tell their truck drivers before they even go and talk to the person they hit or the police what to say and what not to say. It's in their company guidelines, it's in their company manuals, and they want to talk to the driver beforehand and try to make them say something, I guess, not as that won't make them sound as guilty, so to speak, for being responsible for the wreck. But so that's kind of what I touched on earlier. It's just there's a lot of other issues involved. The federal regulations, there's the black box data you can get, there's cell phone records you can get. That's very important. And having an experienced lawyer to send out what's called a notice to preserve evidence very, very soon after the wreck occurs is very important, because if, for example, you don't tell the trucking company to, hey, save these digital driving logs from X to Y date, they're not going to maintain them necessarily. They'll probably get rid of them if they can, or they just say like, oh, we didn't save them correctly. They're not under any legal duty to preserve such evidence. So that's why it's important to get a lawyer that sends out those notices in a very timely fashion. And then when that happens and they receive that notice, then they're under a legal duty to preserve that evidence. And then the plaintiff's attorney can come in and help and acquire that evidence and help build the case. Another thing is that, most of these trucks nowadays have cameras. I've handled a few cases where I was brought on the case a little later than I would have liked, but the company didn't preserve video. However, I was able through a lawsuit, I was able to get subpoena power, and I subpoenaed a third party, which was the company that maintained the videos, and I was able to get the videos, almost 6 or 7 months after the wreck, when the trucking company said that they no longer existed. So there's just a lot of things that trucking companies will and will not do. There's some good ones out there, but a lot of them do cut corners, unfortunately,
Yeah.
and that's obviously costing a lot of time and grief and injuries to Texans.
The liability with some of these trucking accidents is different than an auto accident. I mean, you have the driver, you have the carrier, even the equipment manufacturer can play a role in determining fault. Can you kind of explain how the liability is determined?
In almost every case, there's some type of investigation that takes place from some sort of law enforcement agency. Like I said, there's a lot of different laws that apply. Like, for example, truck drivers have to have what are called driving logs. Those driving logs show when the vehicle turns on, whether it's in motion, when they stop, and when they turn the engine off, and anything in between. So one of those things is like hours of service is that these investigators look at to see like, all right, was this gentleman complying with the laws in that case, as opposed to just a regular driver that's not required to have driver logs because they don't drive for a living. These truck drivers are professional drivers. This is what they're required to do. So obviously they have to have a CDL. They have to do medical exams to ensure that their vision is good, that they don't have any other medical conditions that would prevent them from being a qualified driver. And so there's a lot of things that go into play that you wouldn't necessarily consider in a regular accident, like sending a FOIA to the United States Department of Transportation to acquire information regarding the trucking company and their history. Because if they have a bad rap sheet, and they didn't have the corrections or didn't make the corrections that they were supposed to do, then that's just obviously one other theory of liability to help prove up the case and make sure that the clients are compensated properly. Another big one too is, trucking companies and defense lawyers, they always try to delay the case from going to trial.
Delay, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of the best thing because, if there's delays in there, then the victims might end up getting a little bit more desperate for money. And they just want to get the case resolved, or they don't want to deal with it anymore. So, it's always good to have an aggressive attorney that will file a lawsuit immediately and get the case set for trial. At that point, then you can hold the trucking company accountable and really make a big difference in terms of timing and making sure that they comply with everything, especially things like subpoenas or court orders.
You talked about the black box data. What is some of the other evidence that you look for in a trucking case that might be different than an accident between two, passenger vehicles?
In terms of looking for other things, obviously we want to know what things are like. The bills of lading is one other thing. The bills of lading are essentially documents that the driver has to obtain when they start and complete a delivery. So it says what they were delivering, all the contents and whatnot, and that helps substantiate what type of weight that the truck weighed at the time of the wreck. Was it over the gross vehicle rate weighting that the police officers check and maintain? If not, if they're over that weight, then they can be held accountable, fined, or even fine the trucking company for not complying with federal regulations. So definitely the black box data from the truck. You can also get things from what's called the ABS module, which is the anti-lock braking system module. That also has a lot of data that we usually have to hire some sort of engineer to retrieve. Cell phone data, telling them to preserve the cell phone. Any pictures or videos, like, for example, if the wreck happens at an intersection, and there's a gas station right there, specifically, I've done this many times. We're going to the gas station like, hey, I'm so-and-so, I represent this person. Do you happen to have any video from the wreck? And then, other things, just sending, like I said, FOIAs to the US DOT to obtain information regarding the trucking company, or to sending an open records request to the law enforcement agency that investigated the wreck, because they typically create a crash report that has all the general information and police officers' opinions of how the wreck occurred. But those open records requests have call logs, they got 911 records, they include videos, they include photos, and then when there's a death involved in the trucking company or a truck driver, then those police officers and law enforcement agencies are required to conduct an investigation that's much more thorough than any other motor vehicle collision. Taking measurements, taking speed, taking photos, getting statements from anybody and everybody, and just acquiring as much information as you can.
In Texas specifically, because you've been in this industry a while, do you see trucking companies being better? Is things getting better out there? Do you anticipate they're going to continue to get better or worse? Or where do you kind of see the trends going within the industry as far as accidents and liability are concerned?
Sadly, I don't see them getting any better. I'm not trying to badmouth all trucking companies, but every trucking company has some dirt that they always try to cover up and prevent from being disclosed. Specifically here in Texas, unfortunately, the insurance companies and lobbyists for those insurance companies have donated to a lot of legislators, or even in some cases, Supreme Court justices, Texas Supreme Court justices or other judges, to basically try to favor the insurance industry and the trucking industry when it comes to regulating laws and possibly limiting the type of compensation that an attorney like myself could obtain for injured Texans.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing that's very important. And, that's one thing that it's why we need to have a good organization that really fights for plaintiffs' lawyers like ourselves, because everybody is entitled to a jury trial and have their day in court. That's the Seventh Amendment. And that's one thing that you always want to, be mindful of that you have. But, a lot of these big donors and whatnot from like insurance companies are trying to limit our abilities and make the laws much more stringent to prevent any type of large compensation for our clients. And this is another thing about, the insurance industry in general. And another reason why to hire an attorney immediately is because the insurance company will come in and try to offer you money right off the bat. They may not even know anything about the case. They haven't spoken to any witnesses, the truck driver, nobody. And they come in and say like, all right, well, here's $5,000. If you want it, we'll give it to you right now. Just sign this settlement agreement and you won't come back for any more money. And, some people just don't know the law. They think the insurance company is trying to help them.
Yeah, they think they're on their side. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And then so later on, they find out that they still have ongoing medical issues. They still have ongoing pain. They still have lost wages. And they try to go back and try to get more money. And the insurance company says, too bad. You signed this document and took this money. If you're not entitled to anything else, we're not giving you anything.
Yeah, case is over.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And then they try to get things like recorded statements from the victims before a lawyer gets involved that represents them, and ask them a lot of misleading questions that can be used against them. And if you're just not familiar with the industry or the rules of the road or whatnot, you may be misled and say the wrong thing.
Right.
And that's why I always tell my clients, do not ever give recorded statements to insurance companies. They're just going to use it against you and ask you misleading questions.
Don't get me started on the insurance industry. I'm sure it's going to come up a lot more in future episodes. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in to MF Garza Law Firm, helping injured victims one Texan at a time with Miguel F. Garza. To connect with Miguel and his team, head to mfgarzalaw.com and be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. We love having you be a part of our community. Miguel, I loved having you here. Thanks so much for your time and appreciate all the insight.
Pleasure. My pleasure. And should anybody ever need anything, more than happy to help. My staff and I will reach out to you as soon as possible. Just reach out to us and we'll do what we can to help you and your families.
Awesome. Thanks, Miguel.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.